Right. Okay. So I know it's weird, huh? All right. So we're gonna go over the first. Just read through the prompt. So using what you've learned from secular ethical theories, pick one of the two options below and explain why the subject's actions were right or wrong. Be sure to cite specific reasons for your judgment by citing one. It should be one of the philosophies we've studied in class for support. Argue from the perspective of one ethical philosophy to demonstrate that you understand the philosophy. So your choices are here, and it says be sure to use vocabulary specific to each philosophy in your evaluation. At minimum, the following vocabulary should be used. So if you do virtue ethics, you should use telos, virtue, vice, golden mean, happiness. Kant's deontological ethics, duty, deon, free will, formula universal, or formula of the end in itself. Utilitarian ethics, principle of utility, happiness, consequences. Rights in ethics, define the rights and the grounding of rights according to either Locke, Regan, or Rawls. And then for principle-based ethics, use the principles from Beecham and Childress. They were on that purple sheet. So those were respect for autonomy, justice, malfeasance, and beneficence. So these are your two options. You either choose one or two, and then you only choose one philosophy to use to analyze it. So the two options are number one, a woman uses donor insemination to have a child since her husband is infertile. She realizes that there is a serious risk that such a procedure might cause tension and instability in their marriage. And the second option is a person ordered to do so by a totalitarian regime kills an innocent enemy of the people as a condition to win the release of his own family or who are held hostage and threatened with death by the government. So you pick one or the other and then look at it from the perspective of one of the philosophies. So let's do the first one. All right. Okay. Yeah, it is going to be in the video now. Oh, well. Okay, so option one, let's see. I'll do blue. And I'm not good at writing on this thing, so we'll do what we can. So option one was the artificial art. If I see IAL, is that? Are there too many I's in that? Oh well. And so the artificial insemination case. So what you do is choose one of the philosophies and look at it from that perspective. So if we start with virtue ethics, we have to ask ourselves, what would Aristotle think about this situation? So we know that Aristotle taught that the telos of the human beings was to be virtuous. And those are basically like good habits, right? Good behaviors. And that without virtue, there's no happiness. You won't feel fulfilled, because happiness for him is like fulfillment. Fulfillment. So this lady wants to, she's trying to find happiness through getting artificial insemination. So the question becomes, is what she doing, is from Aristotle's perspective, would this be right or wrong? What do you guys think? Well, how might he approach it? Any ideas? Right? How come? Okay. So it would be a good thing to do, because for this woman, her telos, because telos is basically, in a broader sense, our telos is whatever is going to bring us fulfillment. And again, for Aristotle, your telos had to include virtue. But you could make the argument that for this woman, part of the telos of a woman is to have a child. So therefore, maybe, for her to feel that complete fulfillment, she needs to do this through artificial insemination. Yeah. So that's an argument you can make. Another way of looking at it is the question of, is what she's doing virtuous? So she wants a child, and that's not a bad thing or a good thing in and of itself, really. It's kind of amoral. But the way she's doing it, we have to ask ourselves, is she practicing virtue or vice here? Because she's also has to think about the stability of her marriage. And so she's violating, she's committing some vices here. She commits the vice of like injustice, because justice means to give people what they're owed, right? And so the question is, does she owe her husband a say in this? Is that owed to him? That's a question you can ask. She's also, when you think about the idea of the friendship and the love between husbands and wives, she's violating that by kind of doing this without her husband's consideration. So you could argue that her actions are not virtuous. And so even though a child might make her happy, like subjectively, because she's doing it in a way that's not virtuous, Aristotle might argue that ultimately what she's doing is therefore wrong. So you can see how, depending on what aspects of her actions you focus on, you could come to different conclusions. And that's okay. Just make sure you have a why. You say why whatever argument you're making is valid, because there's more than one, I think, valid interpretation. Let's think about what if, okay, so what if we have option one, but we do it from a utilitarian perspective? Utilitarian. So what do you think a utilitarian would say about this woman getting artificial insemination without her husband's consent? What do you think a utilitarian would say? Any ideas? Can't hear. Anybody? Yeah.
If the child is useful in society, then it would be a good thing.
Okay. All right. So, yeah. So the principle of utility is the idea that we should do whatever brings the most happiness or pleasure that for the most people. So in this case, the question becomes, is the net happiness at the end for this family, if she has the baby, will this ultimately bring more happiness than not having the baby? So you have to weigh kind of because remember, it's all about consequences. So at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, baby, no baby, and you're going to have to make an argument based on whether or not you think having the baby will ultimately bring the most happiness to the family, or ultimately it's better not to have the baby at all. So students have argued different things. Students have argued like, well, if this woman has this baby, she'll be happier. When her happiness will make her husband happy, and ultimately the consequences will have a net good effect. Other students have argued that she could actually, by doing this, end up destroying the entire family. What if she does this, her husband divorces her, and in the end, it's worse off for everybody involved? So this is one of the things about utilitarianism that makes it difficult. We don't actually know what would really happen yet. So you're making judgments based on kind of like speculation, which is one of the things that Kant didn't like about utilitarianism, but that's sort of how a utilitarian would look at it. Now let's take it from the perspective of, here we go. Okay, so what do you guys think Kant would say about this lady and her artificial insemination? And then we'll do principles over here. Do you think Kant would say that she should go about the business of this artificial insemination? What do you think? No? Why not?
I think he would say no because, like, if the husband had a problem with it, I think Kant would say that it would be her to make the choice with like something that would affect them both.
Okay, yeah, because ultimately, remember one of the things for Kant, so for Kant, he doesn't really care so much about the consequences, but he had, for Kant, you always look at the categorical imperatives, and you have the formula of the universal, and then you had the formula of the end in itself. So for Kant, one of the things that he really doesn't like is when people lie. Because when we lie, we make exceptions for ourselves. So we can imagine, what if the tables were turned? What if the husband were doing this same action? Would the wife be okay with that? And I think it stands to reason that no, I doubt she would want her husband to go and inseminate some other woman because she couldn't carry a child. So based on the formula of the universal, Kant might say no. Then the formula of the end in itself, one has to wonder, is she using the baby and her husband as means to an end? So, the question becomes, is she just using these two people as the means to the end of her own happiness? Is she having the child for the sake of the child, or is she having the child for the sake of her own happiness? And then where does that leave her husband? She's, kind of doing this all without his permission. So I think ultimately, from a Kantian perspective, this couldn't be the right thing to do. I think if she tells him, then it kind of changes the story. Now, what's interesting with looking at it from a rights angle, or if we look at those principles that we studied the other day, one can ask, does she have a right to a child? If you believe that she does have an intrinsic right to a child, she might make the argument to her husband. She might say, well, look, I have a right to have a child, and you don't have the right to interfere with this right of mine. That could be an argument made from the sort of the principle of rights. Then you have to ask, does her husband have a right to have a say in this? And that's another question. And then with the principles, remember autonomy. Remember, one of the principles that we studied was the principle of autonomy. So if she has autonomy of her own person, then she could argue to her husband, look, I have autonomy. It's my body. It's my choice, and you don't have the right to tell me I can't have a child. And again, that's based on that principle of autonomy that came from, Childress and Beecham. So that's one way, looking at principles, you might argue it. On the converse, you could argue that she shouldn't do it based on the principle of justice, that she's violating it. She's violating the justice she owes to her husband by having the baby. But you could see how, depending on what you focus on, you could take different arguments. Yeah.
She would probably be violating it in other circumstances, such as she married this man, and her their intent was not necessarily everyone wants to have kids or anything, but if she wants it, I feel it's just, it takes two people
Yeah.
Did it on her own, it would just be unjust because he would have to take care of the child too. It's not just her.
Right. Yeah. And that's yeah. You're kind of highlighting there the injustice of it. That it's one thing if it's just her, but she's making decisions for him, so she's not respecting his autonomy, right? That's like so. Yeah. You could use the autonomy argument in another way. So again, you guys can make whatever arguments you want. I just want to see that you can use the vocabulary, and you can do the thinking. And again, you pick just do a Kant or just do principles. You don't have to do more than one. I just want to see how your minds are working. So do we have time? Yeah, we have a little more time. Now let's take a look at the other option. The other option, there, see? All right, so the second option was that you kill an innocent person to save your family. So I think it's pretty, Kant, it's pretty easy, right? What would he say? No way, right? So for Kant, it's a pretty easy to see that he would say no because it violates the categorical imperatives. You're making an exception for yourself, because if the roles were reversed, you wouldn't want to be killed to save someone else's family. And it's also obviously using a person as a means to an end. You're using this innocent man as a means to the end of saving your own family. So for Kant, that's a pretty clear answer for him. What about a utilitarian? What do you think? And this is the arguments I get from utilitarian ethics is interesting. Yeah. So what do you guys think a utilitarian would say? Kill one innocent man. He's innocent. You got to kill him, but it's going to save your family. What do you think a utilitarian would say? Anybody? Ideas? The argument that most students seem to make is, according to the principle of utility, you bring, you say, where are we going to get the most happiness for the most people? And it's a pretty simple equation. You have one guy versus a whole family. So most students will argue from a utilitarian perspective, the right thing to do would be to kill the innocent man, because you're ended up with a net gain of more people being alive. However, other students have made I got to find, maybe before the test I'll read you a couple from last year. Someone brought in the idea of the being at a benevolent, the benevolent spectator and the idea of the common good. A couple people wrote paragraphs last semester where they said, look, John Stuart Mill said you shouldn't be motivated because it's your family. You need to do what's best for the common good of everyone. And if the government wants you to wants you to kill this guy, then you should do that because it's the best in the long run for everybody in society. You shouldn't be worrying about your own family. What happens if you don't do this? Is it going to cause political unrest? And I've seen students make interesting arguments from the perspective of you can't put because Mill, like Kant, thought that you shouldn't make exceptions for yourself. You shouldn't put your own needs first. So that's another way people have taken it. In terms of looking at, in this one with Aristotle, and then rights and principles, Aristotle. I think Aristotle, this is a difficult one. What do you guys think? Oh, is it time to go? Oh, you're just leaving early. What do you think Aristotle would say? Do you kill the innocent man to save your family, or do you allow your family to be sacrificed because you can't kill an innocent person? What do you think Aristotle would say? I don't know. I think it's kind of hard. I think if you look at it from and this would also go under the idea of the principle of justice, that it's unjust. A virtuous person does not kill innocent people. And the idea that good people do good things, that ultimately the virtuous person, despite the fact that he would want to, obviously saving your family is also a virtue. I think Aristotle might argue that ultimately a virtuous person couldn't kill an innocent person to suit themselves, because it'd be kind of selfish, right? Maybe he might see it as selfish. In terms of rights and principles, remember we have the principle of beneficence. I don't think I spelled that right. It's a weird word. Beneficence means you do good, and then non-malfeasance, I don't even know how to spell that. It's the silver rule. So that's do no harm. If in this case, you would be violating both of those principles if you execute this innocent person. You're doing that innocent person harm, and then you're also, when you do people harm, typically you're not willing them good either. I think in a principles-based ethics, that you'd have to say that no, you shouldn't kill the innocent person. Although you could try to argue it from another perspective. Again, as long as your arguments are valid and you say why, that's the most important thing. Make some kind of claim and then say, this is true because, or, however, we know that Kant would say that you shouldn't because of this or that. Just make sure you justify any claim. And as long as it's not made on like false principles or something, or on mistaken ideas of what the philosophers believe, then you'll be good. How does that sound? Good? Is this helpful? Okay, good. So hopefully, and again, look at the, you can look at the different, think about the different prompts, and keep it simple. You pick one of the cases, one philosopher, use as much of the vocabulary as you can. So let me take this, we have 10 minutes. Let me turn this off. Stop.